And by going into our underclass structure, going to be 7 converging factors going to push us. To get my little summary up. 1, we're going to have an increased amount of conservatism in the country, and I'm going to talk about conservatism in a few minutes. 2, we're going to have a massive, unending influx of immigrants into the country, going to push us down. We have been the number 2 population in America now for over 460 years. We're going to get kicked out of being number 2 and going down to number 3. When are we going to go down to number 3? We're going to go down to number 3 in less than 2 years. Now, when I wrote my book, about 4 or 5 years ago, Hispanics at that time were 9% of the population. They've now moved in 6 years from 9% up to 11%. Blacks were 12.3% 6 years ago. They're still at 12.3%. Now you got Hispanics at 11 and blacks at 12.3. According to the Census Bureau 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., they anticipate Hispanics passing blacks right on time, as I had predicted. Now, Wall Street Journal, the left-hand column 2 weeks ago, on the left-hand side of the page, I can send it to you for one, it says that when Hispanics passed black people, at that time, the whole political structure was shifted here. There'd be a power shift in America. That nobody's going to go to black folks to ask them anything anymore because you're no longer the dominant minority population. They're already preparing for this. They're already creating all kinds of major programs around the country where they would go and check with Hispanics about anything they want to know about minorities. Black folk would get their information through the Hispanic Society. Then by the year 2005, the Asians are going to pass black folk. Then you're going to get kicked from being number 3 down to number 4. At that point in time, you're locked in and frozen because everything you need will have to pass through those 2 groups. And those 2 groups do not have your interest at heart. They don't understand your problem and don't care about it. If you can't compete, they're going to say that's tough. And so what we're going to try to do today in dealing with that one issue, as well as conservatism and the problems of technology in America that's also going to make us push us in the underclass, is to teach you how to compete. We got to understand we got these problems, but you got to understand where the problems came from. And I want to give you a real fast education today, because the real clue to liberation is not only education, it's re-education. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm going to show you how we got into our dilemma and how we got out of it, how we must get out of it. Nothing has happened to black folk by accident. Everything that's happened to you has been systematically programmed through what I call social engineering. You are a victim of historical social engineering. Now let's go back and start dealing with some of these issues. And a lot of this would you also find covered in my book, Black Labor, White Wealth, and the other 2 books I got coming out this year. One is called Dirty Little Secrets, and the big one is called PowerNomic. How do you do it? And PowerNomic, if you want to know what PowerNomic is, because I'm going to talk about it a little later, PowerNomic is teaching my people how a new way of seeing, thinking, and behaving. And that's what the whole thing will be about this morning. You got to change the way you're seeing and thinking and behaving. Why? Because I said we've been locked into an underclass structure, because we got 2 major problems in America. One problem is that maldistribution of wealth and resources I told you about that's in South Africa and America, where whites own and control everything. That's your number 1 problem. The second problem we're going to talk about this morning is the inappropriate behavior pattern of black folk. Those are the only 2 problems you have. I don't care what anybody else talks about in America. It's not worthwhile wasting your time. The problem in America is not drug abuse, crime, low-income housing, public housing, food stamps, welfare, teenage pregnancy. Those are symptoms of a problem. The symptoms are the fact that you don't own and control anything to run you and control your lives. That's the problem. And the second thing is inappropriate behavior patterns. And before I get into the inappropriate behavior patterns, let me define that for you. Now, in current day terms, I might call it the Rodney King syndrome. It's pretty familiar to most of you. That's when somebody pulls you out of a car, breaks your jaw, breaks 3 ribs, cracks 2, knocks out 2 teeth, gives you a concussion, breaks your wrist, breaks your kneecap, and stomps you, and you say, why can't we all get along? That is inappropriate behavior. Or if I'm in Detroit, Michigan, when I was there functioning as an assistant police commissioner during the riots, and I was working on riot possibilities and techniques in the city, I get a call down by some people who had been involved in a couple of murders. And he said, look, I didn't have anything to do with it, Anderson. I just witnessed it. I said, what happened? Well, you see, they had a disturbance in Detroit, Michigan, and the police broke into a motel and found 2 black boys in there with some white girls. And they didn't like that, even though they were in a black neighborhood. They had paid for the room. It was their right and privilege to be wherever they wanted to be. It was between them and God. But the police officers were white. They were very disturbed about this. So what they did, they took those two boys on a Friday, and they beat them all day Friday. They beat them all day Saturday. Then by Sunday, they had gotten tired of beating them. They said, well, we'll just go ahead and kill them. And so one of the officers picked up a rifle, and hit the oldest black kid in the back of the head with a rifle. The kid was only about 22 years of age. Hit him so hard that it knocked one eye completely out of socket and bulged the other eye and broke the rifle stock. And the poor kid fell on his knees and crawled around and found the broken stock of the rifle, and on his knees held it up and apologized for having a hard head. That is inappropriate behavior. The question should have been, why are you brutalizing me and killing me? What have I done to you? And so that's kind of inappropriate behavior. It's what we've been systematically programming to displaying as black folk in a very highly competitive society. So what I want you all to start thinking about today and all throughout my speech today is not who you're against, but who you're for. I want you to understand that you're in a very highly competitive situation. You're going to be competing to survive and prosper. And that's what racism is all about. Contrary to what anybody tells you, and I just saw a definition of racism in the Washington Post last week by a noted columnist who's a conservative, and what he was really talking about was prejudice and discrimination. He wasn't talking about racism, but he was mystifying the word. That's why I finally figured out why he's always on the wrong side of an issue relating to black folk. He thinks that a black person can be racist. A black person cannot be a racist. Racism is a power relationship between groups of people. That's all it is. It means when one group of people have control of so much wealth and power and resource that it can deprive, hurt, and injure and exploit another group to benefit itself. Never in the history of this earth have black folk ever controlled that much resources and where they can have gone out of their way to exploit, injure, and do something to whites. So therefore, racism only started in the 16th century when he began to commercialize slavery against blacks. That's when racism started. There was no such thing as racism before that. The other thing, and before I get into my presentation, you got to understand racism also comes from the word race. Race means group. So whenever you hear people talking about now, you cannot prove racism because somebody fired you from a job, they are absolutely right. And the power structure and all the white think tanks in Washington know that. That's why you can no longer prove racism, because racism does not apply to an individual. It applies to a group. And because I discriminate against you, that's individual, that's personal. It's not group-based, and so you can no longer prove group-based discrimination. The second thing about the word race, remember also, which is very important for our discussion today, is the word race means being in competition. See, they didn't pick house, tree, car. They said racism. Race means being where people are competing from here to there. And we are in competition. That's what racism means. Black people must learn how to compete or survive, or not compete and perish. And so this morning we're going to start talking about what we got to do. Now let's go back to when everybody said, where did this start? Let's go back to where it started. It all started in Africa. And as I go through all this, I want you all to keep some points. And I'll stick my finger up there. Remember those points. Those are the points going to be hurting us today. Those same points I'm going to articulate to you today. Now all this started in Africa. Let's say about 1441. There was a guy called Henry the Navigator who went around the coast of Africa and he found some slaves and traded some slaves off. And he brought them back to Europe. And he took them back to Europe and he gave them to the Pope as gifts. And the Pope in the Catholic Church was so beautifully appreciative of these slaves that he then said, since you've given me these slaves, what I'm going to do now is award you 300 miles of the coastline of West Africa, which is now called the Gold Coast. So Henry the Navigator was given land by the Pope, the Catholic Pope, and the Catholic Pope didn't even own the land.